Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Bob Goodman. I'm in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, and I am thoroughly delighted to welcome you all here to this exciting event and to celebrate with the many co-sponsors of Stan Robinson's visit this lecture tonight. The Honors College here in just its first 2 years has established itself as a core element of the academic scholarship of our campus. And I think we owe thanks to those whose vision it was brought us the Honors College. And by that, I don't mean just the president and the chancellor and the donors, but I also, although they certainly deserve our thanks, but the Honors College floats on the vision and commitment and hard work of faculty, students, and staff who've created a community that is at the core of any academic enterprise. The frequency and the quality of the lectures that the Honors College has sponsored, with many co-sponsors, is a distinguishing feature of our new Honors College. The style with which these events have been, well, stylish, inclusive, and varied, and bringing us truly distinguished visitors. And tonight's is a case in point. So I'm not a sci-fi reader. I guess the motif is cli-fi for this specialty. At least not since Jules Verne in my boyhood years. So in addition to reading from his primary work, including New York 2140, I dug a bit into what others have had to say about the genre and about tonight's lecture. And my eyes have been opened. The downright credibility and indeed optimism that Robinson weaves into his stories, and the pleasantly forced way in which he gets you to think about important and difficult things. Indeed, the imaginative possibilities inherent in threats to the status quo that drive creative responses. Matt Ridley, the former editor of Science and Technology at The Economist and now a member of the House of Lords, is an old friend of mine. Matt is the author of many books, including The Rational Optimist, where he makes a political case, and many would argue also a weak economic case for future optimism in the face of the horrible things that we have done to the earth and to ourselves. Not to diss an old friend, but Matt's argument seems to come down, and I've said this to him, to pretty much the idea, hey, overall the conditions on life have improved since the Industrial Revolution, and the data generally show that that's true. But he doesn't go much further than that. He just says, hey, we've done it before in the past, we'll be fine in the future. Stan, it seems to me, comes with a rather different and more useful message. From him, I hear a clarion call for new thinking about governance, which those of you who know me and have heard me before know that I have a bit of a passion about. Social justice, about taking collective responsibility for the future and creating, as Tim Kreider wrote in The New Yorker in 2013, quote, a credible utopia, one that doesn't, like, say, Skinner's Walden 2, rely on a revision of human nature, unquote. Rather, Stan offers utopian constructions based on the human raw material that's available. Some of it not very pretty, and all of it very familiar. Together, though, with a political vision that is at once radical and, once laid out, logical and indeed even inevitable. Inevitable in the sense that if we're going to get this right, we must adopt a vision, a new vision of governance. So that, and in the past days, thanks to Stan Robinson, allows me to appreciate science fiction, indeed the power of science fiction, and as a result, open my eyes. So one of the other enlightening things that I read in preparation for this evening was a terrific review published by Bob Kopp of New York 2140. Bob's a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences here at Rutgers. He directs the Coastal Climate Risk and Resilience Initiative, and is fast becoming, Ross Baker, watch out, Dave Robinson, watch out, is fast becoming one of the most widely quoted and indeed trusted sources on sea level rise and other issues relating to the future and the past of our climate. So the very topic indeed that's at the center of Robinson's book and his lecture tonight. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Bob to introduce the speaker. Bob.
Thank you, Bob. Before I introduce Stan, I want to thank all of the co-sponsors of this great event, which include not only the Honors College and the Coastal Climate Risk and Resilience Initiative, and also Bob Goodman's office, the SE Office of the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences Executive Dean, but also the Cook Campus Dean, the Institute of Earth, Oceans, and Atmospheric Sciences, the Rutgers Climate Institute, the Rutgers University New Brunswick America Converges Here program, and the Office of Undergraduate Academic Affairs. I also want to let you all know that, as you can see, this talk's being videotaped, and if you want to refresh your memory, it will be available online in a couple weeks. So Stan will introduce his book and give some remarks and give some readings, after which we'll have a panel of 4, including myself, who will carry on a discussion with Stan. We'll bring audience questions into this discussion. When you checked in, you should have received a card, so write your questions on that card, and those will be collected a little later. So with that preface, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kim Stanley Robinson, who is one of the leading living authors of science fiction. He's a best-selling author in the New York Times best-selling list. He's a recipient of most of the major awards in science fiction, including the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. He's authored more than 20 books, including the best-selling Mars trilogy, which has inspired a number of the folks in the planetary science department here, and the critically acclaimed 40 Signs of Rain, The Years of Rice and Salt, and 2312, which I should add that I've sometimes assigned in my non-majors How to Build and Maintain a Habitable Planet course. He's also been selected twice by the National Science Foundation to participate in its Antarctic programs, once as its Artists and Writers program, which led to his book Antarctica, and more recently last year in its media program. And in 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine. Stan is a near native of California, having moved to Orange County when he was 2, and received his BA and PhD in literature at the University of California in San Diego. He's also lived in Boston, Washington, and Switzerland, although not in our own region, which is, of course, the topic of the book that we're here to discuss today. One of the prominent themes that runs throughout all of his work are the relationships among humans, their environment, science, and socioeconomic systems. As an Earth system scientist, one of the things I find fascinating about his work is the way in which the Earth system is an active participant, almost a character in his novels, not just a static background against which the stories take place. And it's a character in a way that sometimes pushes or extends a little bit beyond the bounds of scientific understanding, but remains deeply rooted in it. And so it's my pleasure to turn the stage over to Stan to discuss his new novel, New York 2140, and he'll be joined in a little bit by the panel. Thank you, Stan.
Thank you, Bob. Well, thank you, Bob and Bob, for those kind introductions. And it's my pleasure to be here. And Bob described the format of the evening, so I guess I don't have to repeat it. I will talk to you for a while. I'm going to read a couple passages from this book that I hope will give you a sense of what it's about without really giving you a great deal of its texture, plot, or characters, because it's 620 pages long. And there are at least 8 narrative strands woven together in kind of classic Charles Dickens style. And one of the characters, however, one of the strands follows a voice that is sometimes called a citizen, the citizen, that citizen, a city smartass, the city. And so it's really kind of the voice of the city. And What I think I'm going to do this evening is just give you a couple of those that will describe the situation of the book in a kind of a nutshell form to be discussed later. And then we'll have the panel discussion following that. So I reckon I'm going to take up here about approximately a half an hour of the evening. Now, in between the 8 strands of chapter, I decided to interleave with a great number of epigrams, more epigrams than anyone since George Eliot has ever done. And in fact, there's a great New York novelist whose name was David Markson. He died just a few years ago. And he spent his last 10 or 15 years in his New York apartment assembling novels out of note cards that were made of nothing but little stories, mostly about artists, writers, composers, and painters. I recommend them to you. Markson, M-A-R-K-S-O-N, David Markson. Reader's Block, The Last Novel, This Is Not a Novel. These titles are essentially, his last 4 books were all the same format, and they're addictive and beguiling. So I decided to put in David Markson passages to illustrate New York's varied history. And so in between the 2 sections that I'm going to read, I'll give you a couple of these just to give you a sense of how things read. A Coney Island elephant named Topsy killed an abusive trainer who fed her a lit cigarette, and it was decided she was to be put down. In January of 1903, Topsy was electrocuted. 1,500 people gathered to witness the event at Luna Park, and Thomas Edison filmed it, releasing a movie later that year called Electrocuting an Elephant. Electrodes were attached to metal boots strapped to her right foreleg and left hind leg, and 6,600 volts of alternating current were passed through her. It worked. The author of this book is to be commended for her zeal in tracking down much behind-the-scenes material never before published. Not that the pushcart war was a small war. However, it was confined to the streets of one city, and it lasted only 4 months. During those 4 months, of course, the fate of one of the great cities of the world hung in the balance. Fungibility, noun, the tendency of everything to be completely interchangeable with money. Health, for instance. The skyscrapers of New York are too small, suggested Le Corbusier. The invisible hand never picks up the check. Okay, let's get to this section. If I can find it. Oh, good. All right, that citizen. Recall, if your powers of retention will allow it, that after the second pulse, as the 22nd century began its surreal and majestic existence, sea level had risen to about 50 feet higher than it had been early in the 20th century. This remarkable rise had been bad for people, most of them, but at this point, the 400 richest people on the planet owned half the planet's wealth, and the top 1% owned fully 80% of the world's wealth. For them, it wasn't so bad. This remarkable wealth distribution was just a result of the logical progression of the ordinary workings of capitalism, following its overarching operating principle of capital accumulation at the highest rate of return. Capturing that highest rate of return was an interesting process, which became directly relevant to what happened in the post-pulse years. Because the areas where the highest rate of return can be obtained move around the world as time passes, following differences in development and currency exchange rates. The highest rate of return comes during periods of rapid development, but not just any area can be rapidly developed. There needs to be a preliminary infrastructure and hot money and a fairly stable and somewhat educated populace, ambitious for themselves and willing to sacrifice for their children by working hard for low wages. With these conditions in place, investment capital can descend like a sky village on an orchard, and that region then experiences rapid growth, and the rate of return for global investors is high. But as with everything, the logistic curve rules. Rates of profit drop as workers expect higher wages and benefits, and the local market saturates as everyone gets the basic necessities. So at that point, capital moves on to the next geocultural opportunity, flying somewhere else. The people in that newly abandoned region are left to cope with their new Rust Belt status, abandoned as they are to fates ranging from touristic simulacrum to Chernobylic calm. Local intellectuals discover bioregionalism and proclaim the virtues of getting by with what can be made in that watershed, which turns out to be not much, especially when all the young people move somewhere else, following the sky villages of liquid capital. So it goes, region to region, opportunity to opportunity. The march of progress, sustainable development. Always there is an encouraging motto to mark the remorseless migration of capital from an X-highest rate of return to the next prime site. And indeed, development of capital gets sustained. So in that process, call it globalization, neoliberal capitalism, the Washington Consensus, the Anthropocene, the pulse years, what have you, the second pulse became just an unusually clear signal that it was time for capital to move on. Rate of return on all coastlines having been definitively hosed, capital, having considerably more liquidity than water, slid down a path of least resistance, or up it, or sideways. It doesn't matter, money being so slippery and anti-gravitational, with no restraints on capital flight or any other such impediment that the feeble remnant nation-state system might have thought to apply if it had not already been bought and now owned by that very same capital saying bye-bye to the new backwater. So, first you get off the coastlines, because they are a mess and an emergency rescue operation. Poor old governments exist to deal with situations like that. Capital goes immediately to Denver. Although Denver being Denver, snooze fest beyond compare, a fair bit of New York's capital just shifted uptown, where Manhattan Island still protruded from the sea with a sufficient margin. That was important locally, but globally speaking, capital went to Denver, Beijing, Moscow, Chicago, etc., just as the list of drowned cities could go on forever, such as certain awesome writers fond of lists would have already inflicted this amazing list of coastal cities on the reader, but for now, just please consult a map or globe and make it yourself. Yet another great list could be made of all the wonderful inland cities that were untouched by sea level rise, even if located on lakes or rivers, as they so often were. So capital had lots of better rates of return to flow to. Indeed, almost anywhere that was not on the drowned coastlines would do. Places competed in abasing themselves to get some of what could be called refugee capital, although really it was just the imperial move to the summer palace, as always. This is not to say things didn't get weirder after the second pulse, because they did. The flood caused an unprecedented loss of assets and a cessation of trade, stimulating a substantial recession, or let's say a pretty big little depression. As always in moments like this, which keep happening every generation to everyone's immense surprise, the big private banks and investment firms went to the big central banks, meaning the governments of the world, and demanded to be saved from the impacts of the floods on their activities. The governments, being long since subsidiaries of the banks anyway, caved again and bailed out the banks 100 cents on the dollar, incurring public debt so huge that it could not be paid off in the remaining lifetime of the universe. Oh dear, what a quandary. 10 years after the end of the second pulse, it looked like the centuries-long wrestling match between state and capital had ended in a decisive victory for capital. Possibly the wrestling match had always been professional wrestling and completely staged start to finish, but in any case, it looked to be over. Because the bailout of banks following the second pulse crash was huge. They always are. The bailout of the 2008 crash, which served as the model for the two that followed it, was calculated by historians at somewhere between $5 and $15 trillion. One careful guess said $7.7 trillion, another $13 trillion. Both added that this was more than the cost, adjusted for inflation, of the Louisiana Purchase, the New Deal, the Marshall Plan, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the 1980 savings and loan bailout, the Iraq wars, and the entire NASA space program combined. Conclusion, wars and land and social programs must not be very expensive. And compared to rescuing finance from itself, they're not. But wars, too, are good for finance, and a few more happened in the 22nd century, sure. Hundreds of millions of people were suddenly refugees, and that's a lot of terrorists to suppress. This was a continuation of the surveillance state that had been growing through the 21st century, what an earlier time would have called a police state, but at this point, that term would have been aspirational. That this permanent war on terror could have remained a police action and had more success in its stated goals than it was achieving when waged as a pseudo-war was a view only mentioned by radicals whose words encouraged the terrorists. Meanwhile, this aspect of things also created new financial opportunities. Governments, being hollowed out by debt, couldn't properly fund the security adequate to deal with potential opposition, nor were they good at small-scale asymmetrical warfare, meaning police action, which in fact they used to be good at. Since there was a need for more police but no funding for it, private security armies stepped in to fill the need. Lots of them. The rich, being people too, doing all they could to cope with the night sweats and zombie terrors of making 1,400 times as much money as the people working for them, made sure to finance the best personal and corporate security that money could buy, and mercenaries from all the refugee wars were numerous and available. This was good. When you are a small minority and you own the majority's wealth, security is naturally a primary consideration. So, private security armies were everywhere, from Denver to Upper Manhattan. This new industry seemed to challenge a principle that used to be called the state monopoly on violence. But then again, if finance had taken over the state, possibly the state was in effect already a kind of private security force, so that there was no conflict there, but just an infilling of a market, a supply, fulfilling a demand. Alas, as always happens, there were very many quite incompetent new companies in this new business. And an incompetent security company is a scary thing. It's hard to know if the mystery of whether the state was still a force opposed to these private armies could be answered in any way one would actually want to see in the real world. A state revolt against global finance? Democracy versus capitalism? It could get very ugly. That said, we must revert to the concept of soft power and the Pyrrhic defeat, on which more later. In the meantime, along the drowned coastlines themselves, interesting things happened. There existed now a very long strip of newly useless but still strategic shallows all over the world. No one could do much in this strip in the immediate aftermath except get away from it and then get shipping ports operational again. People retreated inland, capital decamped. Governments too left the coastline, relieved to be done with relief, as the remaining problems were intractable. Further salvage and repair was a job for market forces, they declared, but in fact, market forces proved not to be interested. The drowned zones were not only not the highest rate of return, they were the lowest. They were labeled development sinks, meaning places where no matter how much money you pour in, there is never a profit to be made. The same thing had been said of Africa for centuries now, and lo and behold, look how truly that prophecy had self-fulfilled. Recall the requirements for the highest rate of return: a stable, hungry populace, good infrastructure, hot money, access to world markets, compliant and uncontested government. None of these obtained in the intertidal. So, first, looters and salvage crews and displaced residents all paddled in and out with what could be taken away. Then the squatters and the stubborn were left in possession. Others came in from elsewhere, immigrants to disaster. The narrow but worldwide strip of wreckage that they occupied was dangerous and unhealthy, but there was some infrastructure left standing, and one immediate option was to live in that wreckage. Though many stretches of new coast were more or less abandoned, New York, the great blah blah of the blah blah, with uptown still high and dry, yes, people returned to the drowned parts of New York. There is a certain stubbornness in many a New Yorker, cliche though it is to say so, and actually many of them had been living in such shitholes before the floods that being immersed in the drink mattered very little. Not a few experienced an upgrade in both material circumstances and quality of life. For sure, rents went down, often to zero, so a lot of people stayed. Squatters, the dispossessed, the water rats, denizens of the deep, citizens of the shallows. And a lot of them were interested in trying something different, including which authorities they gave their consent to be governed by. Hegemony had drowned, so in the years after the flooding, there was a proliferation of cooperatives, neighborhood associations, communes, squats, barter, alternative currencies, gift economies, solar usufruct, fishing village cultures, mondragons, unions, Davies locker Freemasonries, anarchist blather, and submarine technoculture, including aeration and aqua farming. Also sky living in sky villages that used the drowned cities as mooring towers and festival exchange points. Container clippers in townships as floating islands. Art not work. The city regarded as a gigantic collaborative artwork. Blue-greens, amphibiguity, heterogeneity, horizontalization, de-oligarchification, also free open universities, free trade schools, and free art schools. Not uncommonly, all of these experiments were being pursued in the very same building. Lower Manhattan became a veritable hotbed of theory and practice, like it always used to say it was, but this time for real. All very interesting. A ferment, a tumult, a mess. Possibly New York had never yet been this interesting, which is saying a lot, even discounting all the bullshit. In any case, pretty damned interesting. But wherever there is a commons, there is enclosure. You can bank on that. You can take that to the bank, so to speak. And with things going as well as they were in Lower Manhattan, such that some people even complained that it was getting back to the same old shabby, garbled, expensive bourgeois wannabe mess that it always had been before the floods, there began to rise into visibility a newly viable infrastructure and canal culture, the intertidal, the super Venice, occupied and performed by energetic people who were hungry for more. In other words, taken all in all, a place that might make for a very high rate of return on investment. So, a situation was developing. Push was coming to shove. And when push comes to shove, well, who knows? Anything can happen. Let's see. Okay. Aha. Another little story. Early in 1904, 3 of Coney Island's elephants broke out of their enclosures and ran away. Gee, I wonder why. One was found the next day on Staten Island, and therefore must have swum across the lower bay, a distance of at least 3 miles. Did we know elephants could swim? Did this elephant know elephants could swim? The other 2 were never seen again. It's a pleasure to think of them skulking around in the scrawny forests of Long Island, living out their lives like pachydermous yetis. But elephants tend to stick together, so it's more likely the other 2 took off swimming with the one that was found on Staten Island. Not such a pleasure, then, to imagine them out there together, dog paddling soulfully west through the night, the weakest eventually slipping away with a subsonic goodbye, and then the next weakest, lost at sea. There are worse ways to go, as they knew well. In the end, the surviving one must have lumbered up onto the night beach and stood there alone, trembling, waiting for the sun. Okay, and then I guess I will end with another shorter section from The Citizen. I think this is the last piece of this book I wrote, actually, here in the middle. Winter comes barreling down from the Arctic and slams into New York, and suddenly it looks like Warsaw or Moscow or Novosibirsk. The skyscrapers a portrait in socialist realism, grim and heroic, holding blackly upright against the storm, like pillars between the ground and the scudding low clouds. This curdled gray ceiling rolls south, spitting snow, the needle sleet shooting down through slower snowflakes that swirl down and melt on your glasses no matter how low you pull your hat, if you have a hat. Many New Yorkers don't bother, even in storms. They remain costumed as executives or baristas or USA casuals, but always in costume, usually in black, acting their parts, the only concession to the storms being a long wool greatcoat or a leather jacket without insulation, with many a tough guy and gal still in their blue jeans, that most useless pretense of clothing, bad at everything except striking that cigarette smoker's pose which so many appear to value so much. Yes, New Yorkers more than most regard clothing as semiotics only, signaling toughness or disdain or elegance or seriousness or disregard, all achieving their particular New York look in defiance of the elements being just a dash between subway and building, and thus they not infrequently die in their doorways while trying to get their keys out of their pockets. Yes, Many a dead New Yorker's body has emerged when the snowdrifts melt in the spring, looking startled and indignant as if to say, what gives? How could this be? Those who survive the storms, despite their nitwit attire, move about the city with their hands thrust deep in their pockets, because only the outdoor workers bother to wear gloves. They keep their bare heads down and hurry from building to building on the hunt for a quick Irish coffee to reanimate their fingers and heat up enough to stop the shivering and fuel a quick trek home. Would take a taxi if they ever took taxis, but they don't, of course. Taxis are for tourists or for the fucking executives, or if you've made a dreadful scheduling error. The Hudson on these stormy days is gray and all chopped by whitecaps trailing long lines of foam. It'll stay that way until it freezes, the clouds low over such a charcoal sky that the white snowflakes stand out sharply overhead, and then are visible tumbling sideways outside every window, also visible from below as they fall onto the streets and instantly melt. Looking down from your apartment window over the hissing radiator through the grillwork of fire escapes, you see that the trash can lids are the first thing to turn white, so that for a while the alleys below are weirdly dotted with white squares and circles. And then the snow chills the street surfaces enough to stick without melting, and everything flat quickly turns white. The city becomes a filigree of vertical blacks and horizontal whites, all chopped and mixed together, a Bauhaus abstraction of itself, beautiful even if its citizens never look up to see it, having dressed so stupidly as to make every trip to the corner store a worst journey in the world, with that fatal doorstep result possible for the most foolish or unlucky. Then after the storms, in the silver brilliance of late winter, the cold can freeze everything, and the canals and rivers become great white floors, and the city is transformed into an ice carving of itself. This magical chilly time breaks up, and all of a sudden it's spring, all the black trees tippled green, the air clear and delicious as water. You drink the air, stare stunned at the greens. That can last as much as a week, and then you are crushed by the stupendous summer with its miasmatic air, the canal water lukewarm and smelling like roadkill soup. This is what living halfway between the equator and the pole on the east side of a big continent will do. You get the widest possible variance in weather, crazy shit for day after day, and just as the cold is polar, the heat is tropical. Cholera festers in every swallow of water, gangrene in every scrape, the mosquitoes buzz like the teeny drones of some evil genius determined to wipe out the human race. You beg for winter to return, but it won't. Days then when thunderheads solid as marble rise up until even the super scrapers look small, and the black anvil bottoms of these 70,000-foot marvels dump raindrops fat as dinner plates. The canal surfaces shatter and leap, the air is cool for an hour, and then everything steams up again and returns to the usual fetid, asthmatic humidity, the ludicrous, criminal humidity, air so hot that asphalt melts and thermals bounce the whole city in rising layers like the air over a barbecue. Then comes September, and the sun tilts to the south. Yes, autumn in New York, the great song of the city and the great season. Not just for the relief from the brutal extremes of winter or summer, but for that glorious slant of the light, that feeling that in certain moments lances in on that tilt, that you had been thinking you were living in a room and suddenly, with a view between buildings out to the rivers, a dappled sky overhead, you are struck by the fact that you live on the side of a planet, that the great city is also a great bay on a great world. In those golden moments, even the most hard-bitten citizen, the most oblivious urban creature, pausing only perhaps for a walk sign to turn green, will be pierced by that light and take a deep breath and see the place as if for the first time and feel, briefly but deeply, what it means to live in a place so strange and gorgeous. Thank you. Now, I think we can call up the panel very quickly, but I can also just add, well, maybe just the panel, huh? It is what it is. It was a huge adventure. I guess I would also, among many things, like to thank my friend Eileen for showing me such of New York and the research for this book. I went to some very odd places for a tourist to go, places where public transport wouldn't have taken me. And it was an adventure. I was on the hunt. I was looking at that bay with the eye of someone trying to turn it into sentences. And that's an act that I recommend to everybody, because it's essentially a kind of hunt for meaning and a hunt for the thread through the maze. So it was a marvelous experience, and I'm really happy to discuss it more here now with Laura, Bob, Jorge, Marjorie. Shall we? You're not doing it? Come on up, folks.
Great. Well, thank you for those great readings.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, while we're getting set up, let me just introduce the format. So we have 4 different perspectives. I'll start, and then my colleagues will go. And after each couple minutes of remarks, we'll offer a question to Stan, have a little bit of discussion, then move down the line. And once we've done that once, then we'll get into a more free-flowing discussion, and we'll bring audience questions into that. But before we do that, I want to introduce my colleagues here on the panel with me. So seated immediately to my left is Clint Andrews, who is a professor of urban planning and policy development and the director of the Center for Green Buildings at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, where he's also an associate dean. Clint's research addresses behavioral policy and planning questions related to how people use energy and the built environment. Professor Andrews was educated at Brown and at MIT as an engineer and as a planner. He's worked in the private sector as a design engineer and a technology assessor. He helped launch an energy planning program at MIT. He helped launch the Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy program at Princeton, and is widely published, including, and perhaps particularly relevant to this book, a text on industrial ecology and global change. Clint is a fellow of the AAAS, a current distinguished lecturer and past president of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers Society on Social Implications of Technology, and a winner of the Brian O'Connell Distinguished Service Award. And he also co-edits the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. To his left is Professor Laura Lawson, who is the Dean of Agriculture and Urban Programs and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. Laura received her master's in landscape architecture and PhD in environmental planning from UC Berkeley. And her research includes historical and contemporary urban agriculture and community open space, including a couple of books on the topic of community gardening. Dr. Lawson teaches community-based design studios and seminars focused on social issues in design and planning, participatory design, and the public landscape. And in her role as the Dean of Agriculture and Urban Programs, she's particularly focused on academic and outreach efforts that connect the urban and suburban communities with agriculture to enhance New Jersey's economy, landscape, and culture. And finally, at the left edge of the table is Professor Jorge Marcone, who is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and a core faculty member in the program on comparative literature. Professor Marcone holds a PhD in Spanish from UT Austin. At Rutgers, he has been a fellow with the Center for Cultural Analysis and the Center for Historical Analysis. Professor Marcone specializes in the environmental humanities as they inform or are informed by cultural archives, repertoires, and interventions from Latin America and Spain. His current projects follow the impact of popular and indigenous environmentalism in the national politics of Andean countries, as well as their relevance for ongoing new research on political ecology and political ontology. And in his research, he pays particular attention to the literature, films, and arts of Amazonia. Jorge is interested in their affinities with theories of sustainability and community resilience to environmental change, and in the ways text, audiovisual media, and performances are conceived as the action of human and non-human agencies. So with that introduction, I'm going to talk a little bit about the science in this book. Stan's reading sort of gave you a little bit of the background of these pulses of sea level change. In the future set out in this book, there are sort of a series of pulses of rapid ice sheet collapse and sea level rise, with the first coming in the 2050s, leading to about 10 feet of global mean sea level rise in the course of a decade, and serving as a sort of a focusing event, spurring sort of more serious action on greenhouse gas reduction. So the idea being perhaps it takes a little bit of an extreme situation to push us out of our inertia. However, those actions weren't enough to avoid a second pulse that's set in the end of the 21st centuries, driven by initially melting in the East Antarctic in the Aurora Basin, and then later sort of cascading around the world's ice sheets, leading to the total of 50 feet of sea level rise in New York. That, as Dan has said, is not really a scientific target so much as what he needed to get this beautiful setting that he lays out of sort of a canals in lower Venice. So if we look at the current science on sea level rise, it sort of suggests that 50 feet by 2140 is thankfully probably quite implausible. If you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projections, they estimated that in sort of a business as usual, burn all the fossil fuels we can sort of scenario, global average sea level rise is likely to rise by about 1.5 to 3 feet over the course of the century. Our group's research here at Rutgers, part of that thread is focused on sea level rise projections, and we generally agree with that, but notice that the IPCC, when it projects, only talks about what's likely, what they would call a 2 in 3 chance. So there's a significant amount of probability, roughly 17% chance, that they're higher than the IPCC range. And that's really important if we want to think of, say, dealing with climate change as an insurance problem. Now, if we told you there's a 17% chance that something's really bad might happen, you might want to know a little bit more detail about what's in that 17% chance. And so our work to date has suggested that you could imagine sea level rise about as high as 8 feet by 2100 and 18 feet by 2150 as being physically plausible, though extremely unlikely. But that sort of gives you a sense of perhaps false precision, because there's a lot we don't know about the behavior of ice sheets, particularly ice sheets like the ones that Stan's referenced in his book that are sitting below sea level. And in that situation, there's a bunch of science that's been emerging that's suggesting the ice sheets can get into sort of tipping points and internal feedbacks that can lead to rapid loss of ice. For example, think about that marine-based ice sheet in the Aurora Basin. It can be attacked from below by warm water that can set up sort of a positive feedback leading to its collapse. Ice sheets can form unstable ice cliffs at their margin. And there's been some recent work suggesting that if you start to think about those processes, the 8 feet by 2100 or 18 feet by 2150 may be more likely than that sort of 1 in 1,000 chance that our initial work suggests. Still, even if you probe as far as you can into sort of the tail risk, it's very hard to get to 50 feet before the 23rd century. One element missing from Stan's description that's sort of relevance for our region is that you don't actually need 50 feet of global sea level rise to get 50 feet in New York. Sea level doesn't rise at the same rate everywhere. The land here in New Jersey and in New York is sinking. In New Jersey, we're getting about an extra inch per decade as a result of that. And in addition, because of the way the Earth's gravitational field and the Earth's rotation responds to melting ice, we get about 25% extra sea level rise when Antarctica melts. So rather than 50%, maybe you could get away with 50 feet, you could get away with 40 feet. But this story isn't really a projection. It's using the science as a basis. So my question for you, Stan, you clearly know the science quite well. You're married to an environmental chemist. You hang out with NSF folks and us in the academia. What's your view of the role of science in a story like that? How do you go about integrating the scientific perspective into your story?
Well, it really varies story by story depending on what I want out of the story itself, because science fiction is not an integrated and uniform thing. It has subgenres within it, and it can range from almost a documentary factual report on the day after tomorrow to a completely surrealist and even lunatic fantasy of the far future where science isn't even a factor, and everything in between. So it's an extremely broad spectrum of possibilities that science fiction can give you. And every story calls out a different use of the sciences and the facts. But one thing is for sure, you want always readers to be in a flow state where there has been a willing suspension of disbelief. And one of the most reliable ways of creating that willing suspension of disbelief is a sense of realism, a sense, oh yeah, this accords perfectly with what I already know of the world. So in that case, you might be best off just writing straightforward realism. In 2017, you know, I took a drive, took the train out to New Brunswick, and you know, you write your novels like that. But if you go a little bit away from that, you can still create the effect of the real, and this is a literary technique. And the effect of the real is by putting in extraneous realistic details where the reader realizes, well, that doesn't have any plot value, it doesn't have any symbolic value. The only reason the writer put that in there is because the writer is being faithful to the reality of the situation, had to put that in there because it really happened. So the effect of the real is a very powerful literary technique. And what I like to do, and it has become kind of the Kim Stanley Robinson brand at this point in my career, is to flood the narrative with details that hopefully are interesting in and of themselves, but also create a very powerful effect of the real so that this quite weird and surrealistic stuff I'm doing in my plot will nevertheless be accepted as part of the story. So in this case, it was very generous of you not to, in fact, in your review of New York 2140, not just point out, well, this couldn't possibly come to pass. There's a couple things going on there. We are very bad at figuring out the speed of ice loss on this planet, and the estimates have changed radically from time to each time the scientific community revises their estimates of the speed of the process, the levels of uncertainty and the speed of the ice loss and the rise of sea level tend to be going up. And that gave me an opportunity. They also tend to end in the year 2100 as if that would be like the last year of history. And so the graph just ends there. And then lastly, this James Hansen paper of 2016 came in very useful to me because he and a group of 18 co-authors published a paper that was quite artful in its construction, in which they were suggesting that there was a time in the Eemian, about 120 to 130,000 years ago, if I recall right, when global average temperature went up 1 degree Celsius, like we've already done now, and yet sea level rose about 10 meters in about a century, 10 to 15 meters. This was inexplicable, and then they began to go down and look at Antarctica more closely than they had before. So I loved that paper for its potential to give me what I wanted in this story, because I wanted Lower Manhattan as Venice, and that just meant more was better in storytelling terms, and in terms of shock value and provocation, and making this people pay more attention to what is really going to be a true problem. So I guess that's how I did it in this particular story, was how much can I wanted the maximum amount that you could still justify scientifically if you had to.
Okay, so I really enjoyed reading this book, first of all. I'm an urban planner, and that means that I think a lot about buildings, infrastructure, the inhabitants of the cities, money, and fairness. And you have all of those things. I was going to say hip deep, but kind of neck deep is probably better for the case of this book. You have all those themes. To help me sort of... Okay, sure. To help me sort of feel this viscerally, I went up to New York last weekend, and I got on the train here in New Brunswick, and then switched to the path, and went under the Hudson, emerged out of the tunnel into that beautiful new Calatrava white-winged bird of a subway station, and walked towards the water and encountered, of all things, ice skating on the Hudson, on an ice rink, I admit, not on the Hudson itself, but this was still April. and then tried to look up at the Freedom Tower and take a picture, and I couldn't take a picture of both the bottom and the top of the Freedom Tower because it's already that high when you're that close. And that made me feel like this book could already have been happening. It also got me thinking about a question that planners have played with, and especially those with an environmental bent, and that's this idea of self-sufficiency and self-sufficient urban buildings in particular. One of the things that your story has is these great buildings with wet feet where they produce their own energy. They have farms, they have their own, they provide food, they provide water. They do everything except provide work for the people who live there. And I was thinking, that is the unrealistic part of the story. And yet it's also, I think it's an important part of the story. Basically, I think it's easy to imagine being self-sufficient outside of the city. All you need is 40 acres and a mule. In the city, you don't have much space. You're packed together. Basically, cities have always needed hinterlands and maybe always will. It turns out that we actually wrote about this stuff. I went and found the paper. It was exactly 10 years ago. And we invented something that we thought was very daring. It was the 2020 Tower. And it was 150 stories tall. And every 30 stories, there would be a living machine in it that would turn wastes into nutrients. And it was festooned with wind turbines and photovoltaic panels to provide the energy. And we built a model of this building and a computer simulation model to see if we could get it to be self-sufficient. And to help us calibrate our model, we went to a building located in Battery Park City in your intertidal zone and studied its inhabitants and its systems, which included some fairly daring things like a wastewater treatment plant in the basement. So it aspired to self-sufficiency. And technically, what we learned was that you can collect some energy and some materials from the surface of a building. You can use energy and materials very efficiently. You can recirculate them and recycle them. And yet, the second law of thermodynamics still catches up with you, and entropy governs, and all the good stuff dissipates, and there is waste. And it turns out that it takes a lot of energy to clean that water that you've so carefully saved, and the cleaning produces residuals, which are not all recyclable, or they're not all nutritious. And so we discovered that self-sufficiency is costly, and even more important, it's subject to behavioral constraints, even more than technical constraints. And so that led us down a path of trying to invent behaviorally robust buildings and cities. And so the question that I'd like to pose is, broadly, why place self-sufficient urban buildings in your story? And it's clear upon reading that at least one building almost becomes a key character in the story, and certainly its occupants are key characters. But broadening out from that a little bit, how do you view and use the built environment in your stories?
Well, thank you for that. And I'm realizing that the text doesn't have a clear enough description of how these buildings are only semi-autonomous. That a purely self-sufficient building, particularly I chose the old MetLife Tower on Madison Square because it is modeled architecturally on the Campanile in Venice, in San Marcos Plaza. So there's a Venetian building already in Manhattan, so it made a nice joke for my story and a place for my characters to live. And then structurally, the novel is a building novel or an apartment novel. It was a French thing in the time of Zola, that you would organize a book by all of the characters that lived in one building, and they would be from all different walks of life, and you would follow them around like an anthology of stories. And it was sort of like also New York Naked City, one of the 1950s TV things. So this is a building novel. But I take your point, especially if you crowd the thing, make it a residence hall, put a couple thousand people in a building like that, like the hotel there on a completely full night. You can't feed them all, nor can you generate enough energy on a even with really good photovoltaics, like science fictional photovoltaics. I did manage to describe them as being part of a flexible grid, that when they make more power than they're using, they send that power off to a substation. When they need more power, they get that power back from the substation. And that is, I think, a system that is being set up in many urban settings of flexible power. And then the more power and food you create, and I was really thinking of a kind of almost symbolic farm that would give you 5%, 10% of your food, that would be good communal work, and then you would compost your wastes. You would just do a little bit to create a more efficient city and reduce its footprint. So these were my thoughts, and a lot of my more practical thoughts came in the problems of waterproofing. The skyscrapers are footed in bedrock, and so they're going to be okay. They could turn into Venetian cities with some retrofitting. The parts of the city that are landfill, not so much. There aren't skyscrapers there now in Midtown because that land can't support the skyscrapers to begin with. Once that land would be saturated by seawater and in the intertidal or underwater all the time, the buildings in it would be doomed. So a chapter that maybe I should have read was about the replacement of the landfill zones buildings with essentially floating dock raft blocks, that the ordinary Manhattan block would begin to float in place and rise and fall on the tides, and people would remain in place but no longer fight the ocean, because you can't fight the ocean very well, not unless you've got some really good bedrock to help you. So these are, there were two things going on here, and maybe I can talk about this a little bit more at the end, of science fiction's always doing two things at once. So let me remember to come back to that at the end. The science fiction as a stereoopticon. But in this case, I was trying to play the game of the secondary and tertiary articulations that makes world building fun when you're reading literature. But also, these are exactly the retrofitting type operations that are going to happen in the real city. And it's fun to portray those in advance of the fact, in a Jules Verne kind of way, like Bob was mentioning.
It was an absolute pleasure to read fiction, and to, my secret identity is I love to go home and not read technical books and not read academic books, but to read science fiction or mysteries or other things, because as a landscape architect, they're vivid, right? They can capture a landscape, they make it come alive, and it's one of the most kind of reaffirming, re-energizing kinds of ways of rethinking an issue. And what I really enjoyed with your book was how vivid the landscape was. Not just the issue of the streets becoming canals and the Venice motif that was going through it, but also that you were interplaying the socioeconomic situation and how that was shaping the landscape. Because as a landscape architect, it's not the environment, it's the environment plus people that make a landscape. And so lots of decisions made, the banking system and other factors coming into play that made it really rich. And so the way I was interpreting the issue with the self-sufficient buildings had to do with your story about the rapid decarbonization, that we had many technologies already on hand, but they were finally economically viable. We have solar. Suddenly solar is going to be more viable because we don't want to be using gas anymore. Or the bicycle comes back, or urban agriculture as another case in point. So easy fixes because we already have the technology, it's just that the economy kind of allowed them to start happening. And when I was reading it, I was thinking about those kinds of small moves that we can start doing right away that are related to this issue. And urban agriculture, of course, is the area that I love. The history of urban agriculture is that it's, people like to think about it as this new thing, but it's not a new thing in any way, shape, or form. It's been in cities since we've had cities. But it's often happening at a very local level, and it often has to do with resiliency at the household level or at the community level to get through something, usually a war or an economic crisis. You have them all. So urban agriculture fits very nicely into the story. And you do say that you're not saying that it's solving the food issue. You're saying 5 to 15% of the food could be grown in these spaces. And it's a beautiful imagery because it's in the loggia of the MetLife insurance building. So you can imagine kind of every scene that happens at the farm is happening with this view of Manhattan. And the people in it almost inevitably start looking out over this super Venice while they're in this bucolic landscape, while they're engaging in cultivation. And it's that kind of imagery that kind of seems to sustain the characters in some kinds of ways. Which brings me to what the way I was kind of thinking about this idea of self-sufficiency and the community that was building at the MetLife insurance insurance. And that is that when it comes to things like community gardens, urban agriculture, even today, when low-income communities work together to address issues about land vacancy, or they're working together to address issues that are facing their neighborhood about safety, it's not that they can address the huge structural issue. They are trying to make their way better. They are trying to live. They are trying to have quality of life. And these characters are doing that. They are working within a system that is much bigger than them, and they're trying to figure out that piece that they can control. And by working together, they're getting somewhere. So the composting, the agriculture, they eat together. There's certain things that start kind of suggesting a community building process that I think in your book is very important because your overall message is political action and really taking over the system, which when it comes to kind of community-based activism, it can often start at that very local level that enables people to feel empowered to take it to the next step. Your case in point was Charlotte, right? That she comes into that political action. So I was reading it more from a kind of a social place, that you're enabling the characters to take more power by giving them these very localized opportunities for having an impact on their own lives. But I did see that you helped me call into question this whole idea of resilience. In landscape architecture, we talk quite a bit about resilience, especially since post-Sandy, as the solution, that we have to create these landscapes that can absorb some of this change that are happening in it. And what I was realizing after reading your book is that we don't talk about the fight against resilience, which might be political action. That you shouldn't create a system that allows you to just kind of keep the status quo, but you also have to be fighting for what is better. And that I think is something that your characters start to do towards the end of your book. My question for you, though, has to do with Central Park. And that is because your motif is Venice. And have you all been to Venice or
Yeah.
There's not much green in Venice. And there's not a big park in Venice. But Central Park represents New York, right? You couldn't do a book about New York without Central Park being a character in the book. And it does appear. And it appears as the refuge after a, can I give?
Yeah, big storm.
Big storm.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler
a big
alert,
storm
sorry.
Is coming.
Oh. And I wanted to know kind of like how you married those two. That's the place where I saw the merger of these landscapes of this kind of water Venice and then very traditional imagery about New York and this land, which in your book doesn't change. This description is very much like it is now, which suggests that there's a view that the landscape doesn't change with climate change, which it would. There'd be different trees. There'd be kind of a different landscape in that place.
Well, I was following the map, And so once I chose a 50-foot sea level rise for the world, the way it marks Manhattan is peculiar, and it was a surprise to me. Lower Manhattan is literally much lower than Upper Manhattan. And from about Empire State Building up to Central Park, it rises to a level that would be above that flood. So Central Park would remain the same, and New Yorkers are very devoted to Central Park and very defensive of it. Changes would be resisted. Even if the land became more valuable because Lower Manhattan were flooded, I don't think Central Park would change much. I did postulate that Onassis Pond got filled in because they had enough water around. They didn't need it anymore, and became a meadow. And this was one joke, but the thing is that if storms get stronger in climate change, which is one of the things that's being postulated, that one of the wicked storms, if it struck New York directly, would be incredibly devastating to the trees. Like that microburst that crossed southern England in the 90s.
And there was a microburst in Central Park.
Yeah. And a really big hurricane striking New York directly, and especially the saturated ground, et cetera, et cetera. It always strikes, it seems to me that the loss of trees would be the sad part, that you can't quickly fix, that it's a matter of friends going down and being ruined forever. So it was one of the scenes in this novel that was most upsetting to me, and a kind of a slap in the face, or the emergency that is the climax of the novel, which is that you can harden buildings, but you can't harden trees. And a hurricane force wind at its worst is usually, New York hasn't been hit by a really big solid blow since 1893. The unnamed hurricane of 1893 had a 30-foot storm surge, and they don't even know how strong the winds were. But imagine a 180-mile-per-hour wind hitting Central Park from the east, south, or west, anything but the north, and it would be in terrible, terrible trouble. So that seemed to me to call out that needed to be written. And I do love the urban gardening thing. I realize that I myself have ended up living in a garden, a kind of a hippie suburbia, if I could put it that way. And I have a garden patch at the end of my lane that has been mine to garden for the last 24 years, and also a place where I can have a really big compost heap. And so I've been hands-on working on these issues now for 24 years, starting from, I must say, complete ignorance. And I remember a very frightening moment of looking down at a new broccoli plant and thinking, I wonder where the broccoli comes from. That level of ignorance was a little terrifying.
Without consulting with Clinton, last weekend I was also in New York. Took the New Jersey Transit and then the Path and got to the new station and watched the Calatrava building. I spent Friday the workshop for the Modern Language Association in Lower Manhattan. And during the breaks at the lunch, I indulged in explaining to my colleagues in that meeting at what level we will be covered by water, pools, or under the second one. And since I noticed that retelling your story and paying attention to the details was bringing to me so much attention, I decided to continue this during the weekend. We were staying in New York City. We have relatives visiting from Peru, from Lima, Peru. So we had to do the usual sites. But of course, this time I have the benefit of telling in each different site, I can tell a different story that was not in any of the books that they have read. And that worked very well. I think they make their visit more interesting. But also it helped very much to make the point about sea level rising to a bunch of Peruvians who live in a city that is already probably more than 50 feet above sea level. So it's hard for them to understand sea level rising, other than the nice restaurants and by the coast where you can get this wonderful ceviche will be all lost. We even we have some kids in the group. We took them to watch Beauty and the Beast. But I was able to capture their imagination as we were coming out from the movie theater. We took the subway in 86th Street, line 6, and I was able, as if I were in a Harry Potter situation, to tell them that in this station is a very crucial moment of the novel in which this is totally underwater, and two young men that are being held prisoner in a trailer somewhere underwater will be rescued because somebody found their way through the water in this very, very same station. And that erased all the impact of Beauty and the Beast. So I thank you at many different levels for this book. While I was reading your book, I was reading also, catching up with reading from a colleague from the University of Georgia, my colleague Mark Anderson, who has written a book on disaster writing, disaster narrative. He refers to Latin American fiction in that book, but he came up with a definition of disaster that works good enough for the analysis of the literature. And I read your book with this definition side to side. Of course, disaster has to be an event that, with consequences that go way beyond a threshold of what we consider foreseeable and acceptable, right? In any level, economic, social, death, diseases, and in general, when we cross that threshold of what can we accept about loss. Mark also suggests that disaster narratives, when considered as narrative coming after the disaster, are very powerful political narratives. Usually, there is a moment in which discourses, powerful political discourses, get legitimate or delegitimate as a consequence of the disaster itself. And it's also narratives about accountability. Who is responsible for this disaster? Then he also says that we need this narrative to make sense of the disaster. What is the meaning of what is happening with this disaster? And finally, he points out that it's true that usually literature, art, fiction, culture in general is precisely the side where these different narratives are competing immediately after the disaster, maybe than in any other public space. So trying not to be a spoiler and just based on what you read from The Citizen earlier, I checked this pattern, and from there I came up with my 2 questions. Since I'm the only one representing the humanities, I will take advantage and make 2 questions. Actually, the first one is going to break down in 2, but we'll get there. So the debate, there are a bunch of disasters throughout the narrative, but it seems that there is a tension between the fact that there seem to be plenty of technological advances. There is, at a certain point, a decarbonization process gets started globally. There are some original actions taken against the extinction of species, some creative things being done. And there are all these subcultures, alternative cultures, hipster culture as well, in submerged lower Manhattan, but everywhere, that nevertheless seems to be defeated again and again by the strengthening of the neoliberalism, the globalization, the Anthropocene, or whatever, as the Citizen says. They get defeated by concerns about security. Sometimes they get defeated by conservation from people representing some old, but by the time of the novel, all forms of conservation. And in general, it seems to me that different generations face a different disaster, and they lost memory of what was the experience of disaster to the previous generation. Mm-hmm. So when I put those things together, the reference of a definition of disaster with that debate that goes on in your book, I noticed first a couple of things that were, maybe 3 things that were missing, and I was wondering if you would like to entertain expanding a little bit the book as we informally talked about it. One of them have to be that there is very little or none presence of international agencies or international forms of governance when dealing with, and you rightly say that you pick New York because it's not only because of New York, but because it's representative of many coastal cities and what may happen. I didn't see either playing any significant role religion or in general religious discourses. And of course, to me, that would be a protagonist precisely at that moment in how do we give meaning to these disasters. That's probably when, but not necessarily in that occasion, when religion would have been one of those discourses in the debate, trying to make sense of the disaster. And the third one was art, culture itself. I was wondering what kind of writers will the writers of the 22nd century be? You invite us to consider that possibility. You have all these wonderful quotes about literature and art. I'm not going to start quoting from them, but you resort to almost to a whole history of literature, particularly New York literature. And I'm thinking, what will the writers of the 22nd or the artists of the 22nd century be? And finally, my last question is, this New York City that can't stop being New York City. No matter what happens, it's always New York City. No matter the level of the characters, every aspect of the city keeps on represented. It's a very resilient city in a way that it's kind of a negative resilience, right? Well, then the Anthropocene, this global capitalism will be able to survive all this. I won't go further into the fiction, not to be a spoiler, but for a big portion of the book, we see surviving in striving many of the things that, on the other hand, we want them to stop being, at least from the perspective of the book. And also, although I'm not sure, because I'm not that familiar, after all, with New York, but I was your citizen in the book, with that impatience, that intolerance with stupidity, that attitude, that identity about trashing New York but celebrating everything of New York. I was wondering if you have found in a New Yorker voice and attitude and identity, a good spokesperson for this kind of problem.
Excuse me, but yes, thank you for that. That puts many of the issues right there. It was a little frightening how easily the citizen spoke through me and was a kind of late entry into the writing of this novel, in that I had written most of the other passages when it seemed to me that I needed, or the voice of the city seemed to be obtruding and wanting to tell the story from his perspective. I think of him as male because that's what I was hearing. And it has to do with sports fandoms, and it has to do with being a Californian and visiting New York, and it has to do with the cliche and the stereotype of the New Yorker and just the way that you characterized him so well. Every novel, when you're writing it, at some point, if you're lucky, throws out a kind of a surplus energy in one form or another that can't be predicted in advance and it isn't something you can control, but is called out by the story. And in this case, I would say it was the citizen. International aid, I think when we get a crisis as bad as, if we get a decade of rapid sea level rise, that our systems will be overwhelmed. And yet at the same time, I think something that Naomi Klein has talked about in the shock doctrine. It isn't necessarily the case that disaster per se will end capitalism, because you can quickly move capital elsewhere and then rally it and then begin to make money off of the volatility. Volatility itself being a financial value, and the liquidity always beats illiquidity when it comes to the game of differential advantage, which is what finance is about. So I think the citizens' description of what happened after the second pulse is all too plausible as something that will happen to us. And the home of global capitalism is the United States of America, home base, and the residual destination for a great deal of the loose capital that exists in this world is still the United States. So the plot of the novel eventually comes to this. Can we seize global finance for democratic purposes and turn it into an instrument of the people, by the people, for the people? So money as a public utility district, a government agency being put to use for the people. Can we do this? Well, this is the question the book tries to explore ultimately. Now in that thing, I'm always leaving religion out of my books, except for the one called Shaman, which is really about the first religion, shamanism. Because I guess I'm thinking that I'm always writing about a humanist future where we are trying to seize history, that literature is my religion, and history is the project of what we're trying to grab hold of. And so whatever transcendent meaning people try to give to that is a kind of private project of their own, but somehow doesn't come in the purview of my novels, typically. As for art and culture generally, in this book, I'd say it was New York that is the work of art. It's a performance art, it's a landscape art. It's something that multi-generational and collaborative of all of the people that live here and in the region. And the amount of man hours, as they would call it in the construction trade, is mind-boggling. And I'd love to have a calculation of that sometime, the total number of hours of human work it has taken to build that infrastructure and then to keep it going. Well, it's longer than the lifetime of the universe, so it doesn't compute. We would come up with a number that would be quite startling, I think. But I always come to the city and regard it as maybe accidental or unconscious, but on the other hand, pretty explicit also. The stubbornness of holding on to New York as a transtemporal project that is a kind of an artwork. It's easier to see that if you come from a small town in California, because the strangeness of the project is really evident, but also the beauty of the project. The sublime. Burke talked about the sublime as being a combination of beauty and terror. That maybe the situation is best illustrated if you're up on top of the Empire State Building in the lookout place. Well, your senses are telling you, okay, I'm about to die. This is really way too high, and you seize hold of the railing. And so that's the terror. But then your rational senses say to you, you know what, you're not going to die. There's a guardrail, just hold on, it's all okay. And then the beauty comes in, and it's the combination of the beauty and the terror that makes this composite emotion called the sublime. Well, sublimity is a rare and beautiful thing in this world if you pay attention to it. If you don't become inured to it by the many examples of the technological sublime, where some aspect of technology, like looking out your airplane window or whatever, has given you the sublime, but it's so common and so overwhelming that you never really feel it. So it's a kind of 18th century emotion. We've somewhat lost it, somewhat by overdosing it on all the time. And so sometimes we even crave the anti-sublime. Like if I can just walk down and sit in my garden in the dirt, in the sun, this is felt as like a relief. People go on vacation from sublimity. Please let me go to a beach somewhere and turn off all my machines. And so the city might be an overdose. I think it is maybe an overdose, but it's an overdose of something really quite stunning and beautiful. It's a great artwork. in the way that maybe a cathedral in Europe was a great artwork. Very briefly, I want to say what I think science fiction is doing in this double aspect. It's like the 3D, science fiction is like the 3D glasses that you wear in movies when you go to a 3D movie. One lens is showing you one thing, one lens is showing you something that's not quite the same, and only by looking through both of them and correlating them inside your head do you get a third dimension. Through one lens, the book is really trying to show you what New York will be like in the year 2140. It's an attempt at true prediction. Through the other lens, it's really just a metaphor for what New York feels like right now. And so all science fiction has that metaphorical aspect to it. It feels like zombies are at the gates and I better get my gun. You know, this is the metaphor of science fiction. And so when you have the two together, if they manage to pop in your head, what you get then, that third dimension, that artificial third dimension, is history. You're getting a historical sensibility that's actually cast out into the future, deep time. And it's something that science fiction does better than the other art forms of our time. It's a particular, it's the particular aesthetic effect that science fiction gives that others can't give as well. This sense of our lives in history and the rocketing forward into history that we're doing right now. So I just want to explain that as being what I think science fiction is up to and why it has a power and is maybe what you might call the best realism of our time. I think science fiction is actually the realism of our time and for sure the best one.
So while the questions are being gathered, I had one.
Yeah.
It's really, I'm seeking a methodological tip. So urban planners think about the future, and we try to start conversations about what should our city look like a generation from now, maybe a century from now. And one of the things that your book does is it describes the world of big city finance very effectively. And although it sounds very much like a story of the 2000s, although projected into the 2100s,
Yep.
the system persists into the future, in other words. And so the tip I seek is, how do you decide which things remain determined? How do you decide which relationships are going to persist into your speculative future?
I guess, well, this speaks to this double aspect I was talking about before, and I think what happens is the things you want to talk about the most that are really the dominant in a project, you should assume are unchanged, and you're writing directly about them. So in this case, finance turns out to be very suspiciously like 2008 finance, even in the year 2140. Well, I wanted to talk about, what later we saw in the movie The Big Short. That's a very important movie, and Michael Lewis, John Lanchester, the financial journalists that described to us what happened in the 2008 crash have been really important, and I wanted to join that crowd and tell that story. And as I was saying to Bob, I needed also at the same time to push it out as far as possible in order to justify that sea level rise. So in the discrepancy, you get these strangenesses.
All right. Yes, actually, this is good. So you seem to have a more hopeful look on a very frightening subject. Let's see, I'll just expand on that because I can't quite read the rest of the question. But you've taken sort of this topic, right, that could be a topic of a dystopia, and you put a pretty optimistic spin on that.
Yeah.
Do you see how this, is this sort of a way of trying to help solve the problem and sort of avoid the dystopian? How do you view this sort of fiction as fitting into the broader challenge of dealing with this issue?
It's a little dangerous to do what I've done because the suggestion can be, everything's going to be all right no matter what I do. And also, this looks like a pretty cool place to live, so why worry? Be happy. And, that is a danger, but that I think Zizek calls it cruel optimism. But I also wanted very much to suggest and fight against apocalyptic thinking by suggesting that after the disasters, the generations that follow are going to have to cope with whatever we've done. And if we give them a shitty world, they are still going to be coping and finding partners and having babies and having fun. So the coping, the comedy of coping, I thought was important to emphasize to fight against the notion that apocalypse is going to come and we can just give up because there's not going to be a later generations.
And so another question, sort of you've focused this very specifically on sort of New York. How does, when you were imagining this world, sort of how does the broader region, broader country, how did that fit into your sort of conception when you were world building?
50-foot sea level rise is 50-foot sea level rise everywhere. But there's a novel can be overwhelmed by that. So I had one character, Amelia, is flying her airship around the world, looking down at everything from 20,000 feet and giving a kind of a broad picture of what the rest of the world is doing. That was one way to cope. The rest of it was just to suggest this is a kind of a choose-your-own-adventure, an opportunity for fan fiction. The book is entirely focused on New York. There isn't even a single sentence that describes what happens in Los Angeles or Miami or London or anything. But the suggestion is there that every one of these coastal places is going to be devastated and is going to have to deal. And then New York just becomes the representative city.
But you do have something against Denver.
Well, yeah, Denver serves as the symbol for all that is boringly inland and stable. Yeah, there's a real, the citizen is particularly down on Denver. Snooze fest beyond compare, as he says.
Well, I think we're about 10 minutes over, so I just wanted to give you a chance for any final thoughts you wanted to share before we wrapped up.
Well, let's see, I'll take that 10 minutes back. Let's reel it backwards, 10 minutes in time to the actual ending point. No, I just want to say thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And I will say this, that it is a beautiful thing, actually. Let me say this. Science fiction writer for 40 years, and when I began, it was a despised paraliterature such that it might as well have been a comic book writer. And of course now comic book writers are great artists. But back then, and especially for the generations that came before me, the generations of Philip K. Dick in the 1950s, their lives were ruined by the ways in which New York high culture put down science fiction, and still tries, by the way. So I hate New York high culture with all my heart and speak for But here's the thing. Science fiction is a great way of telling modern reality. The world has become a science fiction novel that we're all co-writing together. So as that's happened over these last 40 years, what I've also seen is that every discipline can use science fiction as a narrative that rallies together their own concerns for planning, for science fiction, nonfiction thinking of creating a better future, essentially utopian thinking. And then to see this, whilst I'm still alive and here to see it, is a very heartening experience. I really, really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan, for coming. Thanks for a great day. For the audience, so there are copies of the books available for purchase outside the room, and Stan will be doing a signing. If you would like to buy a book or get a book copy signed, please come out through the front doors. If you're not, I think it'll be easiest if you go out through the back. So thank you all again.
Thank you, guys. It's a pleasure. Yes, indeed. Laura, thank you.